Hello, everyone, and welcome to a session on polarization on a world scale in the age of globalization. This is an important topic, one that has received enormous attention, continues to receive enormous attention, considering a number of important elections from the days to the European Parliament elections. So we have a topic significant for the entire world, not just one country. The other reason this topic of polarization today is because of the war, which is, as it has been ruled by the International Court of Justice, a genocide war. In Israel, the conventional military force, namely the Israeli IDF, has been carrying out a war against civilians, mostly in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. That society, of course, highly polarized, an apartheid society. So polarization is that particular conflict, which has been going on since Hamas did attack Israeli civilians in an unprovoked attack, obviously, given the history, reasons of resistance in pursuit of freedom for Palestinians. Nevertheless, that's been going on since October 7th, and it has not stopped. So that has reverberations across the globe, including in the Western world, where there have been mass protests. Now, polarization, for our purposes, I'm going to focus on social and political polarization, is defined as the discord that exists in a society when a group of people in that society feels it is unfairly and unjustly marginalized, and the or group of people then express discontent with the status quo, with the establishment, with the institutional structure, most importantly, the state. The fact is that the history polarization is something that emanates from the masses, when in fact polarization is expressed by the masses invariably against elites. So the question is, although polarization finds expression amongst groups that feel persecuted, marginalized, oppressed, the question is, what are the structural or systemic causes of polarization in any given society? And not just today, by the way, and we'll look at some statistics with different countries, considering there have been public opinion polls for a number of countries, and there is some sense of which countries are most polarized on this planet and which are the least. And the question is, of course, what are the systemic causes? Now, having said that, let me also note that the fact that there is polarization in any given society is indicative that there is a problem, that there is an underlying problem in that society. And we have, from expressions of mild protests or demonstrations, peaceful and so forth, today and historically, of course, to more active form of resistance. Again, that would be revolutions, like the French Revolution, for example, which was indicative of polarization in 18th century France, with what the Abbé, the writer who authored an essay, What is the Third Estate, argued that the overwhelming majority of the population, well over 90% of the population, is fighting for its rights and its freedom against the elites, the minority, which are privileged. Basically, that formula that the Abbé established for the French Revolution in a highly polarized society, because you can't get more polarized than in a country that's undergoing a revolution, a social revolution, like the French Revolution, by the way. So the polarization aspect is really indicative that there is something seriously wrong in a society, because people do not become active, contrary to what many may assume and think that, oh, well, we have nothing to do. It's a boring Tuesday afternoon. Let's go out and demonstrate. It doesn't work like that. It takes a lot to mobilize people, especially on a mass scale, countrywide scale, to bring them up and to have them protest. They must feel very strongly that they are marginalized, that they are oppressed, they have a sense that there is injustice. So polarization is an important issue in that sense, because it shows that a society where there is polarization lacks social justice and peace. In other words, it's a militarist society, usually countries pursuing militarism as a solution to conflict instead of diplomatic solutions. And domestically, there is a sense that social justice does not extend to the entire population, because the privileged elites deny it to the vast majority of the population. Now, this is more or less as an introduction to this, or a preface to this topic, I should say. I should point out, by the way, that there have been many, many articles, scholarly journal articles, newspaper articles, as well as videos like this one, for example, about the topic of polarization, especially in the era of globalization, in which we have been during the neoliberal model that has been in place from the late 1970s in Chile and Great Britain, then in the 1980s, the United States, and then gradually encompassing most of the world in one form or another. There has been quite a bit of literature and people who go out and read some of these articles, or books, or watch a video on YouTube or whatever other source there is, will find out that the vast majority, at least from my research, the vast majority of the literature and the video and the audio material on this really focuses not on the structural causes of polarization in each given country and globally, as we'll see today, for example, but rather they focus on two elements which are fine as far as they go, but they don't really cover the entire picture. They don't explain fully what's going on. One of the things they focus on is the cult of personality. They focus on a specific individual, namely a leader of a government, like Trump or Biden or Narendra Modi, for example, in India, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, when President of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, was in office, they focused on him. They focus on specific individuals and argue that that individual, that one person, and the policies they adopt, of course, is the reason for polarization. And that's fine as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough, as we'll see. Because polarization transcends the cult of personality. It transcends any one individual, because those individuals represent tangible interests of elites. The second focus, again, for the overwhelming majority of the scholarly literature, the newspaper, magazine articles, online stuff that there is, including videos, is, well, polarization exists because there is a conservative versus liberal divide. There is this dichotomy. We have to address that. And that's what the essence of the problem is. When in fact, as we will see today, that is another rather superficial means of analyzing this much more complex problem of polarization in any given society. And by the way, in each society, the dynamics of polarization, the causes of polarization are different. They're different in India, where the Hindu majority government of Prime Minister Modi is using, for example, religion and the Muslim minority community against that community to mobilize politically the majority and as a distraction while polarizing the country, of course, while polarizing India, as a distraction from the neoliberal policies that that government is adopting to benefit the wealthiest capitalists in the country, the most powerful capitalists in the country. I won't mention the names, as well as foreign corporations. Okay? So what you have is really polarization, on the one hand, decried by, and again, I invite all of you to go out and read, if you so wish, some of these articles, newspaper articles, journal articles, whatever, books, or watch a video, and you'll see that they decry polarization for that reason. And it's almost like saying, well, let's have consensus. Consensus for what? It's not almost, it is saying that really the underlying intent is not have polarization, let's have consensus behind the neoliberal model. Well, The fact is that polarization is important from my point of view, um, and that of a handful of scholars. They're not that many, but there are a number of them worldwide, from Asia to the West, um, who decry polarization because of its larger implications in society. Polarization necessarily entails the decline of liberal democracy, the decline of social justice, and the path toward authoritarianism. And that is the crux of this. So, what we are going to do today is very briefly look at how this complex topic, which on the surface, and I regret to say the surface is some of the, really, I regret to say this because I'm a former, I was in higher education for more than 3 decades, and it's really sad to see colleagues from some of the best universities in Europe, as well as in the from Harvard in the United States, from Harvard to the University of California and so forth, San Francisco State University, Texas, and so forth, argue basically about polarization as though it's really cult of personality and the liberal conservative divide, and that's it, and point out that, well, we just have to address some of the stuff on the surface, some of the areas of discord in society. And they usually, by the way, blame the media and especially the social media rather than looking at the neoliberal model systemically as a whole, of which the media, the mass media, I agree entirely, as well as the social media, these are multi-trillion-dollar operations, as people know, are an integral part of this. And of course, they contribute to polarization, but they reflect that model. It's not that they came from another planet and they're doing something entirely on their own for the sake of alien being. They, whatever they are doing because they are an integral part of the elite, of the hegemonic culture and the elite structure, the institutional structure, and serve that structure. Now, I want to point out that there has been a lot of literature about media and religion as sources of polarization. Now, there's no doubt that religion historically has been a source of discord, a source of separation amongst people of different faiths, without a doubt. The Crusades, for example, that the Europeans undertook in the Holy Land are a good example of that. Even the Catholic Crusades going into Byzantium and sacking Constantinople, of course, which was Orthodox. They were Christians, but they were Orthodox Christians. That's another example of that. There's no doubt that religion has been used, and it filters down, of course, to the masses by the elites as a source of polarization. And there's no doubt that religion to this day, if we look at what is happening in Israel with the war, the genocide war against the people, the Palestinian people, that religion is in fact wrongly, but it is in fact used. Okay, and the same thing we encounter in India, where they try to use Hinduism, the political the dominant political party, the majority party, is using religion. In the United States, they use the Christian fundamental, the conservative GOP, the GOP meaning the Republican Party, the Grand Old Party. They use religion there. In Europe, here in Europe, they use religion in a number of countries on hot issues that they regard as the source of polarization, which here in Europe, of course, for the right wing, it's the migrants coming in from the south here, from Africa, and from the Middle East and from Asia. So religion really historically has been used in that regard. This doesn't mean that religion in and of itself is a source of polarization, but elites, political elites especially, have used it toward a specific goal opportunistically, and that's important. That's important to point out. Now, having mentioned religion, let me just point out, as a historian, of course, I can tell you that polarization has existed throughout history, from the dawn of civilization in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, by the way, which was the first civilization on this planet 5,000 years ago, a bit more than that. From the first civilization in Mesopotamia, the present, there has been polarization because it's built in to the social and political structure. The political structure reflects the division of labor and private property and the hierarchy of society. The fact that society has been hierarchical during civilization, because before civilization we have to accept the archaeologists and the anthropologists and the prehistorian view that the before civilization, before the state, before military, before private property, there was a sense of community when human beings were hunters of animals and food gatherers, and there was a greater sense of community, and the division of labor and the hierarchy that we see both in gender and class doesn't exist. Although there are scholars who argue that there was some form of hierarchy, but not to the level that we have it refined and defined in detail with gradations, levels of hierarchy once the state is established and institutions around the state, built around the state and the private sector. So polarization is built into society because society, whether, for example, in ancient Greece, you see it in the Roman Republic, you see it in the Roman Empire. You even see it with barbarian Europe, that is the Middle Ages, the Carolingian era, the Merovingian era. You see it in the Indian subcontinent. You see it in China. The fact is that the presence of the state and the military and the creation of a division of labor means hierarchies. And that necessarily entails polarization is built into society. And the question is, to what degree is polarization expressed by the public openly? And when it starts to get expressed to a high degree of resistance, and that's the key. In other words, rebellions, whether there were slave rebellions, as in ancient, in the ancient world, whether it was in Sparta or in Rome, the Roman Empire, or peasant rebellions in the late Middle Ages, for example, or revolutions in the more modern period, from the French Revolution, actually going before that, to the British, to the English Revolution, to the English Civil War, actually, I should say, in the 1640s, then the Bloodless Revolution of 1688, 1689, French Revolution, the American Revolution, French Revolution of 1789, the American Revolution of 1776. So you have expressions of polarization in the political arena. The question, of course, becomes is when does polarization become detrimental to society? When does polarization become so bad that it is harmful to society? The fact that there would be an outburst like a civil war, let's take the English Civil War of the 1640s, bloody civil war, that is indicative that there were serious problems with the social contract. And the great English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who lived through the English Civil War and was, of course, on the side of the monarchy, the Stuart dynasty, and abhorred, he was totally against the Civil War. He was against those who rebelled against the monarchy, argued that human beings needed to be disciplined. In other words, you stop polarization by having an authoritarian government. Hence the title of his book, The Leviathan, this monster that imposes control to stop the masses from expressing discontent toward the status quo. Thomas Hobbes, a very astute political philosopher, realized that the social contract was not serving the interests of the people. However, he believed that human beings tend to be chaotic and out of control, and they need to be regimented. Okay? So he looked at the result of polarization, namely the Civil War, and decided that the best way to deal with it is to have a strong authoritarian regime. Now, at the time, in his defense, I'm not defending him, but in his defense, theoretically, that is, in the middle of the 17th century, there was no such thing as liberal democracy. Actually, the father of liberalism emerged after Thomas Hobbes, namely John Locke. During the Glorious Revolution, he wrote the two treatises of government. So he is the father of the political philosophy of liberalism. And he was against Hobbes, by the way, rejected the assumptions that Hobbes made about a polarized society and blamed the elites for polarization. He did not blame the people. In fact, he argued that the people have the right to rebel if they are oppressed. And the question arose, how would someone know when to undertake a revolution? And John Locke's answer was, they would know because they're impacted. That's when people, common sense, right? People will know when they're oppressed, when they're marginalized, when they're deprived of social justice. So the first political philosopher to make the case for revolution was not Marx, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, but rather a liberal, John Locke, England, long before Marx, long before Engels. Now we have polarization in society as we move forward with the Industrial Revolution, because the social structure, the division of labor changes, and there is a division, there is a rise of the working class, and we'll discuss this in a different segment, in a different session, on the rise of the gig economy today, and we'll go back to look at how the rise of the working class movement begins with the first industrial revolution in England in the 18th century. But what we have is, with the division of labor as a result of the industrialization of England and then Europe, the United States, and then Japan, what we have is the working class developing what the great English scholar E.P. Thompson writes was the working class consciousness that emerges. The working class consciousness emerges because there was an industrial revolution. And surprisingly, or not so at all, really, it starts in England because they were the country, that's the first country that had an industrial revolution. So the rise of a working class movement and the rise of a working class consciousness is in England because England had the industrial revolution. It was not in China, it was not in Brazil, it was nowhere except in England, because that's where the industrial revolution was. So polarization starts when the workers demand unionization, solidarity, and they realize what it took them a while to realize who the enemy was. At first, the enemy was the machine itself, by the way. So the Luddites began to attack the machines. But they realized who the enemy was. It was the people that they were working with, their employers, the capitalist class, that deprived them of a decent wage, a living wage, a wage that allowed them to live beyond the subsistence level, what they called in the early 19th century a wage beyond the subsistence wage. In other words, enough for you to live on it, and just enough to be strong enough to come to work, and not to have any hope for upward mobility, although upward mobility does take place with the Industrial Revolution. The reason we have middle class is because of the Industrial Revolution, by the way. So polarization is built into the structure, and it's built into, and it's directly impacted by the political economy and the nature of the political economy. As the political economy changes from industrial capitalism in the 18th century to finance capitalism in the late 19th century, to financialization of the economy today under neoliberalism, which is basically speculating on the market, speculating on the stock market, betting on the stock market, and really valuing wealth on the basis and the well-being of a country's economy on the basis of that speculative value. Okay, that is important because it impacts all of society. It's not just confined, its impact is not confined just to the capitalist class, but to the entire society across the board. It impacts the middle class, it impacts the working class, it impacts the living standards of the working class, it impacts whether they will have, and their progeny, that is their children, will have the opportunity to move out of the working class through education, go into the middle class, have a better life for themselves. This is an important point that I'll come to as I end this session in a little bit, but namely the perception about the prospects of a group of people in society for its future, and how that impacts their own awareness, their consciousness as a group, and what they can do to um, uh, have a better chance. And also that goes to the core of whether they feel that they're marginalized in a polarized society where very few are privileged. Despite the rhetoric, by the way, that there is democracy, that there is equality, theoretically, right, from the French Revolution evolving down to the present, theoretically, most societies promise, theoretically only, equality, freedom, democracy. In reality, though, people, as John Locke, the English philosopher, pointed out, know how the political economy impacts them. They know whether they and their progeny, their children, their grandchildren, have better prospect to live a better life. So polarization enters into the equation there. So you have a polarized society when there is a perception that the prospects for a better life are gone. Now, I want to also go on and talk about divisions in societies, and start with, as I pointed out already, with some data that has been advanced about what countries are most polarized. Historically, at least in the last couple of 100 years, it was just assumed by the West, of course, by the West, that polarization was something that was the domain of the global South, what we used to call during the Cold War the Third World. The polarization is not something that has anything to do with the advanced capitalist countries, right? The Western plus Japan, Australia, New Zealand, right? It's the global South. They have the problem with polarization. Never mind that the reason that they had polarization to begin with was because the global South was subjected to colonization, semi-colonies, colonies, semi-colonies, economic zones of influence, commercial zones of influence. Even China, as I've mentioned in a previous video, was carved up from the first Opium War in 1838 all the way down to the Maoist revolution in the 1940s by the great powers from China, from Russia, Japan, US, and the Western Europeans carved up China into commercial zones of influence. They drew up the map of the Middle East. The mess in Palestine is because the Europeans, by the way, are the ones, primarily the French and the British, drew up that map. So you have basically the polarization that the West goes, well, look, they're polarized. Yes, because they did not come to Europe and to the West and colonize the West and exploit the resources of the West. The West went there to the global South to exploit labor and natural resources of the global South. Of course, there's polarization. They co-opted an elite group that cooperated with them, and the rest, the vast majority, whether in the Indian subcontinent or throughout the continent of Africa or in Latin America, the rest, mostly workers. Very small middle class. When you look at the statistics on the size of the middle class in the global South, historically, okay, versus the size of the middle class in the Western countries, What you see is a sizable middle class in the Western countries, in the advanced capitalist countries, very small middle class, what is called the comprador bourgeoisie. In other words, a dependent middle capitalist class linked in the global South, linked its fortunes, linked to the West, to the core countries, to the metropolis, right? So what you have here is obviously much less polarization in the Western world, in the advanced capitalist countries, because there is a middle class that cushions between the elites and the working class. Hence, the consensus catalyst works. When you look at the statistics in the global South, you don't have much of a middle class. You have very few people who are wealthy, corrupt government linked to the West historically, which the West corrupted, of course. The West set them up. The West, even after decolonization, the West continued to exploit, whether it was Iran until the revolution of 1979 or Nigeria. The fact is, the West continued to exploit the natural resources, whether it was uranium or oil, whatever natural resource, copper, zinc in Peru and Chile, for example, et cetera, et cetera. Coffee and oil in Colombia, Venezuela, in oil in Venezuela. So what we have is a small middle class, large working class and rural working class, in other words, peasants and small farmers, obviously out in the countryside, and an elite, an indigenous elite. So of course there's polarization. It stands to reason. The structure, the social structure is such that one would be amazed if there were not polarization. By contrast, in the Western world, that's not the case. So what has changed now that there is so much polarization in the Western world? Beginning with the United States, by the way, of all countries. And it's not just Trump, by the way. Let's not fall into the trap of the cult of personality. Trump was a product, is a product of the American capitalist system. His father was a wealthy individual investor in real estate, passed down some of that inheritance to Donald Trump. The man worked within, as he candidly stated in 2016, the first time he ran for president. He worked within the system. When they asked him, why did you do this? This sounds crooked. Why did you do that? That sounds crooked. He said, if you don't like all of this, change the law. I operated within the whatever, and of course the law is always bent, but that's why you have good lawyers and accountants. The fact is that the Donald Trump, whether it's Donald Trump, it doesn't matter, by the way, or Modi in India, and we'll talk about him too, or Bolsonaro in Brazil until recently. These people are the products of the elites in their respective countries. And it's not just these people. Why is Biden any different? Biden, if you follow the money, has been as polarizing because of the money that you may follow. If you follow the money trail, it leads right back to Wall Street and to lobby organizations, lobbying firms. And the result is a highly polarized society because his policies reflect the money he receives. But it's not his fault. It's perfectly legal. He's not doing anything illegal. That's how the system is. This is what I mean. that the problem is the social contract. It's the system. It's an institutional problem. Nor is it the media's problem. The media is a capitalist enterprise. The media is there to make money. Most of these organizations trade on stock markets, whether it's Wall Street or European or any other market. They operate as a capitalist enterprise designed to make a profit and to push the neoliberal ideology of capital accumulation. Japan, South Korea, highly polarized societies, by the way. Both of those. Japan and South Korea are polarized, highly polarized societies. A lot of people may assume that they're not because they figure, well, there is that consensus, that neo-corporativism consensus that historically Japan and South Korea operated on. Under neoliberalism, actually, there's polarization in both of those countries, in South Korea and in Japan, just as in the United States, just as in France, where the most important political party in the opposition is Marine Le Pen's neo-fascist party. In Italy, there is Giorgia Meloni's, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's party, which is to the far right. In Hungary, Viktor Orban to the far right. So the right center, Biden is not a far right, but there is polarization. So this idea that it's just the far right that it's the fault, or it's just the pluralist liberals that's its fault, that's a false dichotomy. That is a distraction. And this is why I so much regret that colleagues from some of the best universities fall for this trap that it's cult of personality, or it's the fault of the populist right, or the fault of the liberal pluralists that's the underlying cause of polarization, when it isn't. It's the social contract. It's systemic. It's the whole institutional structure. And in fact, in 2022, I have to look up the statistic, 90% of the American people, according to the Pew Research Center, 91% actually, 91% believe that America was polarized. It's a divided country. When 91% of the population in a country believes that they live in a divided country, in a polarized society, this is not now, this is 2 years ago. And 60% of those, by the way, 60% of those believe that the country was headed toward authoritarianism because of polarization. The Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes, the great English philosopher, Thomas Hobbes' book, The Leviathan, an entity, a monster to control, to regiment the chaotic masses so that government can function like a clockwork. You see, so when you look at the statistics, 91% is both Democrats and Republicans and independents and libertarians and what have you. That is an astonishing statistic. And that's 2 years ago. American society is more polarized now. And the reason we saw it all across America with the college campus demonstrations, so many college campuses, and some of the top ones, by the way, some of the top universities in the United States, students and faculty, not just students, faculty as well, coming out, Jewish and non-Jewish, coming out against genocide in the ongoing genocide in Gaza, okay? And there has been an international court ruling on that. This is not just rhetoric. There has been, regardless of whether Israel and the United States accept the term genocide, that's their problem, and regardless of whether they're going to punish the international court and undermine the rule of law globally and send a signal down the road to the next country that comes up for on charges before the court. If they want to do that, if they want to go down that road, and the reason I'm mentioning this, by the way, is because in that same public opinion poll, where 91% of the population says we live in a polarized country, that a large percentage of that population believe that they had lost confidence in the institutions of the country, both public and private, by the way. We should not assume that it's just that because the media, the mass media and politicians always try to distract people. It's just the government. And within the government, just those specific people. Well, actually, it's the entire institutional structure. And the public opinion polls indicate that the people are not dumb. They're aware of that. They have lack of faith in everything from media to Wall Street. So there is to colleges and universities, to everything, which, by the way, there have been scandals with them. And the way they continue to handle, sadly, I've been reading, astoundingly, I've been reading that some of these top universities have refused to confer degrees to graduates. And companies have refused to hire college graduates who exercise their First Amendment right, namely freedom of expression, in favor of peace, by the way. Stop killing children. If that's wrong, if someone who demonstrates against war is wrong, then that means we have lost the moral compass in society. And this goes back to the value system that is in question when polarization enters the picture. The value system is at the core when society is polarized and a group of people over here, marginalized, feel that the privileged few will not allow the rest of the population upward mobility, a good living, a good standard of living, prospects for a better life for themselves and their children and their grandchildren. That's a sad commentary. And then they turn around and they punish everyone from college graduates. These are college kids in their late teens, early 20s, who go out and do what? They're idealistic. They're supposed to be idealistic. They're young. And they should be idealistic, because there's nothing wrong with peace, by the way. If there's something wrong with peace, then there's something wrong with the world. If it's wrong to say stop killing innocent civilians, there's really something seriously wrong with the world. That is why we have polarization. And because people realize that the elites are trying to marginalize everything, including freedom of thought. It's not just that they want mechanical obedience to the status quo. They want ideological obedience. They want complete obedience, like we're back in the interwar period, in the totalitarian era. or in the 1950s in the McCarthyist period in the United States, when people had to look over their shoulders, they were concerned about whether they would lose their jobs because some relative may have been a member of the Communist Party, which was perfectly legal, by the way. And besides, it was a non-entity in the United States. That's the most absurd thing, that it was a non-entity. It was hardly a threat to anyone. But in any event, so polarization really exists because there is a fundamental recognition on the part of a large group of people, or a smaller group of people, if you will, that there is lack of social justice, lack of peace and harmony, and above all, the prospect for a better tomorrow, so that people can have a better tomorrow. Because I think that no matter how much that George Wilhelm Hegel, the great German philosopher, has been criticized, there is this linear view based on Christianity, of course. There is this view that things are going to get better, that there is this idea of that we will have progress, that things will get better. And it's an enlightenment-based view, that the enlightenment view of progress, that we can solve our problems through reason. Polarization suggests that reason is out of the window. There is the enlightenment-based principles, rationalist principles of reason and freedom and liberty and democracy have been diminished, and we're on the road to an authoritarian path. I do want to point out, by the way, that some societies are less polarized than others. And we can understand this. For example, China. You would think the one-party state, China, would be more polarized. This is not to say that China does not have groups of people who are against the regime for different reasons. They're against the regime because they oppress the minorities, for example, the Muslim minorities in the Northeast, in Xinjiang province. There are those who oppose the regime because they're not pure Marxists, they're not Maoists enough. They oppose the regime because they are not neoliberal enough. So there are groups of people. China is a huge country, 1.5 billion. It's mind-boggling that China ranks as low in terms of absence of polarization, in terms of consensus. And the question is why? And here's where we come to a very important point, because I'm going to have to wrap it up. It's almost an hour now that I've been going at it. Here's where we come to a very important point about people's perceptions and hopes and aspirations for the future. Even if they are not doing well, if there is a perception that nationally we're moving in the right direction, and there is a good chance that at least my children, my grandchildren, are going to do better. More conformity. Despite the fact that here's a one-party state, right? Communist one-party state, no doubt about that. It's not the same, by the way. I want to bring up, since I brought up China, I want to bring up Russia. It's not the same in Russia. Russia, by contrast, there is a high level of polarization, much more regimentation, much more authoritarian measures, especially by this regime, regardless of whether it's foreign policy, with regard to its security zone along the West, in other words, Ukraine. We'll leave that aside. We've talked about it in previous sessions. Regardless of that issue, the fact is there are in Russia people who are nostalgic about the old system where there was a social safety net and they had a sense of stability and security. You know, they weren't wealthy, but there was some stability. There are also people who feel that the system is not mirroring the Western modernization trends. It's fallen back, way back. There are also people who are against the authoritarian Kremlin-led oligarchic clique that controls Russian society. So there is a lot more polarization in Russia in contrast with China. Interestingly enough, Russia has more in common with the United States in terms of polarization, as well as some of the European countries, by the way. I don't want to leave the Europeans out of this. Japan, South Korea, India, which has used Hinduism, and of course, this is an election season, has used Hinduism against the Muslim minority for politically opportunistic purposes to secure the base, the Hindu base. So what we have is polarization. This is the paradox, is being created by the elites who want to preserve their privileged positions. And yet they use polarization. They use polarization as a tool to distract from attacking the status quo, and usually find all kinds of enemies within the substructures. In other words, various identity groups, political identity groups against each other. But they use polarization as a tool to mobilize politically the base, the political base, for themselves. Okay? And keep in power. So polarization is reproduced by the elites for contradictory reasons. Where this is headed is very interesting, because at some point, when there will be, not if there will be, but there will definitely be a very deep recession, much deeper than what happened in 2008, and comparable to what happened in the 1930s during the Great Depression. When that happens, and social polarization reaches the extreme limits, that will mean that people will express their discontent, popular discontent, out in the streets against the political regime. And at that point, it's either going to be full-blown dictatorship, authoritarianism, full-blown, a police state, in other words, comparable to what happened in the 1930s and interwar here, in the 1920s, 1930s and interwar Europe. In other words, comparable to what happened there. Or there will have to be a different road, chosen. It's not inevitable that one or the other has to happen, by the way. The United States could have gone the route of Hitler. It did not. It went the route of Keynesian economics and democracy, liberal democracy, progressive democracy, under FDR. Because FDR and Hitler came to office in January 1933. Hitler and Roosevelt came to office at the same time, the same month. The United States, they diverged. The United States remained committed to traditional, progressive, Enlightenment era values of equality, freedom, expanding the working class, expanding the middle class, providing some social safety nets and social development. That's one route. they chose. All of that broke down when the neoliberal model was introduced by Reagan in the United States. It was introduced by Thatcher a couple of years before that in England, and then the world gradually in the 1980s and early 1990s. So the test for society being polarized is going to be economic contraction on a world scale, because the economy is interconnected. We live in a one world economy. Money has no flag. Money is global, and there's one world division of labor. The fact is that the impact will be global, and there may be a domino effect. So we await to see. The last thing I want to say, of course, again, because it's happening right now, and I would be remiss in not mentioning this. Polarization is also caused by wars. As I've stated in passing, civil war is the ultimate expression of, obviously, polarization. Whether it was the civil war I mentioned, England, but the United States had a civil war. Spain had a civil war. China, Russia, Greece, a number of countries have had civil wars. So civil war is the ultimate expression of polarization. However, wars, which have been used historically from ancient times, from the times of the Peloponnesian Wars between the Athenians and the Spartans to the present, wars have been used for profit and to temporarily bring society together under the status quo, to serve the status quo, to have them conform. In other words, to diminish polarization. So war and social justice, the absence of social justice and the presence of war, I hesitate to say war is a way of life, or as Jimmy Carter pointed out a number of years ago, I think it was about 8 years ago or so, the United States has been at war for most of its history. War is a way of life. The great American historian William Epplewhite Williams from the University of Wisconsin had written a book during the Vietnam War, Empire is a Way of Life, about the history of the United States from its founding to the Vietnam War. Well, it's actually war is a way of life. War is a way of life is itself polarizing. It unifies because people have to rally under the flag. And it seems natural. You feel like a traitor if you don't. On the other hand, war is a way of life is really indicative of the moral compass of a society and the social contract under which it operates. And that's something that people have to think about. Is that the kind of society people want? One where there's an absence of social justice and perpetual war? Those are important issues to contemplate. And whether polarization seems perfectly natural, that it flows from there. Of course, if you have absence of social justice and intermittent wars, why wouldn't there be polarization? I thank you very much for listening. We would appreciate all of your comments. By all means, leave us comments, anything you want to ask. I read them and I reply. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.